October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and in the U.S., 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence by a partner in their lifetime. That's according to the CDC. So to better reach survivors and help people recognize the red flags in unhealthy relationships, the Purple Door is launching a new podcast. Our Taylor Alanis sat down with organizers to learn more about the Unapologetic podcast. And Taylor, this is something that folks can start tuning into here pretty soon.
Yes, Leslie, this Friday will be the premiere of the very first episode. As many of you know, the Purple Door is a nonprofit that provides resources and even shelter to families affected by violence. Well, part of their outreach and education to the Coastal Bend community will now include the Unapologetic podcast. Organizers say it will be full of real talk and raw conversations about intimate partners and relationships. They say it will address myths, legends, and different conflicts, including red flags people need to look out for. The initiative is also a way for people to spot signs of sexual or domestic abuse in maybe their friends' partnerships or even their own.
What better way to prevent it than by educating people, by telling people those little telltale signs, those little things that you don't think about.
Things like checking each other's cell phones. Organizers say that's a toxic habit and a control mechanism often used in unhealthy relationships. They say the hosts are by no means relationship experts, but they are very well trained, and combined, they have more than a decade of experience in working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And something that's really cool is that people can actually submit their questions or their own relationship stories to that podcast. For that information and how you can tune in, head to our website at KIIITV.com. Leslie.
All right, Taylor, thank you so much.